tonight. I've had the privilege of spending the last half hour talking with Julie Sweet, and I'll just tell you, you are in for a treat. This is going to be really a lot of fun. My name is John HAMRE. I'm the president of CSIS, and when we do public events, we always start with a little safety announcement, and so I'm going to be responsible for everybody tonight. You're going to, if something happens, I'd ask you to follow my directions. We'll hear a voice that'll say, please leave, or something. That door is going to be the one closest to the stairs that'll take us down to the street. We're going to take 2 left-hand turns, and then a right-hand turn. We're going to go over to National Geographic. We have a mutual support thing with them. They've got a fabulous show on right now. It's about the Titanic, the discovery of the Titanic. What people don't know is that the discovery of the Titanic was actually a cover story for a secret mission. We had lost a nuclear submarine, the Scorpion, and we didn't know what condition it was in, et cetera. So all of this underwater surveillance stuff was really to find the Scorpion, but we used discovery of the Titanic as a cover story for it. It's a fascinating show. So if something happens, we'll go over, I'll pay for the tickets. And if nothing happens, you go over on your own and buy your own ticket, okay? But it'll just be fun. You should enjoy it. We're really delighted to have all of you here tonight. And at this stage, I'd like to ask CANDI WOLFF to join. CANDI is, of course, she's the Executive Vice President for Global Government Affairs for Citi and has been a champion for this program for so many years. And I want to say thank you to you, CANDI. Please come up here and offer some words of welcome to everybody.
Thank you, Dr. HAMRE. And thank you for joining us tonight in what will be another special event in our series, Smart Women, Smart Power. Citi is and has been proud to bring together women leaders in foreign policy and national security and in our business community to convene a dialogue on many of the pressing issues that face our world today. And the discussion tonight will be a prime example with Julie around artificial intelligence, innovation in the workforce, which is certainly top of mind for so many of us. And at Citi, we're present in over 100 countries. I have to think about that because sometimes we mix up the numbers, but we really are present in more than 100 countries. And I think our unique global footprint is something that helps us offer a diverse perspective around economic and policy challenges, as well as opportunities that we see around the globe. And so I think the discussion tonight around people and resources and AI and machine learning really highlight the interesting conversation that all of us are having, not only here in the US, but globally. Because if you're financial services, for instance, we look at all of the technology, while it has challenges, there's also opportunities to enhance the customer experience and certainly the services that we can provide our clients around the globe. So I'm excited to hear the conversation. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us tonight. It's a little drizzly outside, so we appreciate you being here. And thank you, Julie, for joining us. And Dr. HAMRE?
Thank you so much. This is the second event of the day where we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. I'm glad that Julie Sweet wasn't here for the first one, Andrew, because she said that you need to get a little more urgency in your step about a very good report that Andrew produced. But we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. We're going to talk about Accenture's approach and very interesting, very exciting ideas that they're working on. You all have her bio, so I would waste your time if I read it to you, but please take a look at it. An enormously talented individual, pure definition of smart woman, smart power. Welcome, please. Well, I guess it's going to be you, Kath. You're going to lead it from this point, aren't you?
I am.
Okay, then I'm going to get off the stage. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. HAMRE. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Just a couple reminders. We're taking questions tonight on note cards, so there should be a note card at your seat, and we'll collect them later. And we're also taking questions online. So please, if you don't have a note card and want one, raise your hand. Staff will bring them around. Also, a social media note. Of course, we have a handle at Smart Women and hashtag CSIS Live. So thanks for using those to track us. So artificial intelligence. We're going to talk a little bit about leadership as well. And your pathway to CEO of Accenture and to a leading voice in the Business Roundtable world on technology is not one people probably would expect. You're not an engineer by training, you're a lawyer by training. Can you talk a little bit about the path that led you first to be CEO of Accenture, but also to being one of these leading voices on technology?
Well, I'm still thinking about my introduction that started with Titanic. So I'm like, it's like, no. It's interesting. I would say that while today people would say, being a lawyer is not necessarily a path to CEO, though there are some other great examples. I would say that the training of a lawyer today is never been more important, because if you think about what lawyers do, lawyers process enormous amounts of information and they have to make decisions. You can't say, well, it's one hand or the other hand. You have to make decisions and help clients. If you look at what's happening today with the really epic disruption from technology, there's no such thing as a 10-year strategy, right? There's no such thing as knowing. You have to process and change and continuously learn and then make decisions really in the face of uncertainty. Artificial intelligence is a great example, right? We keep saying it's going to transform everything. Everything has to be reimagined, but by the way, we don't know exactly how, right? Right. And so, I really think about that path as, while maybe unconventional, is maybe serendipitous, that the exact skills that are needed actually are, skills that are inherent in the training.
Well, if you go even deeper in your past, actually, one of the big issues around AI right now, which I do want to talk about, is China and where China's going on AI. And how we should think about the strategic challenge set. But before we get to that, it turns out you have very deep experience understanding China. And in fact, in the 1980s, when most Asianists might have been looking toward Japan, you were actually studying Chinese. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in Asia and international relations?
Yes, and so I always think about life as being moments, right? So what are big moments? And I can tell you a moment that changed my life. I was 17 and graduating from high school, and I'd won a scholarship from the Irvine Company. I grew up in Southern California. And I went to the dinner that night, and I sat next to one of the members of the board, who happened to be a trustee as well at the college I was about to go to, Claremont McKenna. And he asked me what I was studying when I went to school. What you ask every graduating senior. And I said international relations, and he said, what language? And I said, well, I studied French, but I find it kind of boring. And he said 3 words that literally changed my life. He said, how about Chinese? Now, I'm 51, this was in 1985, so you don't have to imagine the date, the age. And at that time, and I grew up in Southern California, so if you left Southern California, which was a big if, and didn't go to Europe, you certainly were not going to China, right? And in fact, I ended up spending my junior year abroad. I lived in Taiwan. It was still under martial law, and when I would go to dinner on my own, my table would often be surrounded to watch me eat, blonde, blue-eyed. And then I went to Beijing, and this was a time when you literally would go to the stores and there would be someone in front of empty shelves. I mean, it was like, everything you think about is hardcore communism and what it was like back then. So it was completely different now. And it was a really important time because it taught me a lot that I now use as a leader. First of all, empathy. What is it like to be not like everyone else? And so at a time when I believe inclusion and diversity is critical to innovation, it's critical at this time in history for companies to truly be innovators. They need diverse viewpoints. I do believe my experience of being in China, in Taiwan, has really helped me understand how to be a more empathetic leader. But it also, of course, as you look back, gave me a viewpoint on a part of the world that was tremendous. And I ended up going back when I was a lawyer and as a partner and teaching at Beijing when I was brushing up on my Chinese. And it's just fascinating to see how much the country had changed and the students and how connected they were. So it's been a really great shaping of myself as a leader.
So coming forward to the artificial intelligence challenge at the strategic level, those of us in the security world, we hear constantly, as you pointed out, AI is changing everything, we don't know exactly how, and the next thing we hear often is, and China is essentially eating our lunch. How do you look today at where the U.S. is, how that sits relatively, and how we ought to think about it just at this very broad strategic level?
Well, I mean, I think the U.S. still remains ahead in artificial intelligence and in innovation. I do think, though, that advantage is being threatened, and in part it's because of the technology itself. I mean, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that artificial intelligence and much of what we talk about now has been around for a fair amount of time. It now has the ability to, because of the change in computing power and the availability of data, to actually have different results. But you could not have another innovation in the actual technology and just implement it, which is really hard, by the way. But the implementation of it doesn't require new core, breakthroughs. And so if you think about the relative advantages of China and the U.S., right? The U.S. is phenomenal at core research and breakthroughs. China is phenomenal at implementation. I'm not saying they don't do research in that, but that's not the historical. Then you add to it that the fuel for artificial intelligence is data. And if you just start with the number of people in China. I mean, they have in mobile payments. So, and of course, mobile payments, what people are purchasing and of all this internet. They have $17 trillion of mobile payments. It's larger than their GDP. It's 50 times bigger than the U.S. That is all rich data about how consumers purchase what they care about, right? And I can go through, fast food delivery, the use of the equivalent of Uber and Didi there. So the data advantage on top of China's phenomenal, and they've got a great entrepreneurial spirit and people. So you really have to think very much about natural advantages. And so today, I think we cannot be complacent in the way that we often were in the past about, we'd say, oh, there's all these advantages, but we somewhat put it back. And I think you couple that with a government that's been very clear that by 2030 they want to be the leader. And we simply don't have that same focus. And I think that's one of the things that Andrew's report is so good on, that was just, that you guys have just put out, is it's really a call to action.
Right. And for Accenture, when you enter into this space, how do you break down practically for a customer, for people who are trying to understand what you do, what AI means, can mean, should mean to them? Do you approach it as sort of this, amorphous AI, or is there more to the story?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a lot of confusion about what AI is, and you quickly get to job disruption, which is really mostly about automation. And so I often start with CEOs to talk about what we call the AAA, which is automation, analytics, and artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is really a set of technologies that are self-learning, that do not require human beings to tell them. And that's everything from vision, so the video, to natural language processing, Siri and Alexa, to machine learning, where you actually learn from large amounts of data. In fact, what's happening in the real world today, right, is a combination of those things. So let's just take, anybody here been on a cruise, right? So now we're working with a cruise line that wants to personalize your experience, so you feel like you have your own yacht with your own personal staff, because you're wearing a medallion and it knows what you like, and it's got the data to understand where you are. Now layer on top of that, as that's being implemented, the learning from your actual purchases and getting more and more personalized, and that's possible today. So you've now got a whole new business model. You make people feel like they have their own personal concierge on what was a large ship with thousands of people. Now think about, why is that example relevant to oil and gas? Well, the ship is mobile. If you're in the oil and gas business, you've got fleets of trucks or ships, right? The ship has been retrofitted with sensors to provide all the data about where you are and to provide you your personalized service wherever you show up. Those kinds of sensors you need in oil and gas so for safety, right? Do you know where people are? And then you've got to educate people, and you have to provide the internet in the middle of the ocean, just like you have remote wells. And so today, industries are even converging in terms of, what we're doing with a cruise line is just as relevant to an oil and gas company or an oil field services company, right? So the possibilities are tremendous, but when you're sitting here as a CEO and you're saying, well, okay, I hear all that, but where do I get started? It's pretty basic. First, is it a strategic priority, and is there a return on investment? So all of this new technology is just that, right? Technology is not an outcome. So we don't throw out the, you know, the sort of the basic business elements. Many companies have, because they said the new shiny toy, AI, blockchain, all of these different things. You start there.
Right.
Then the second is, do you have the right
So
kind
just
of,
meaning like IT, HR, is that what you mean by basic functionality, or what do you mean by that?
No, what I mean is that when someone comes to you and says, we want to do a pilot with artificial intelligence, the questions to ask are, is it a pilot that's in a strategic area?
Right.
And is there a return on investment? So I'll give you an example of automation, which is the lowest form of artificial intelligence. Someone said, oh, we want to automate something that we do 4 times a year for 75 people in the HR thing. And we said, there is no return on that investment. It will cost a lot of money to redo the systems, to use cool automation. You can automate it, but there's no return on investment, right? So, you know, as you sort of get started, you have to start with just the basics. Is it strategic? And is there a return? Today, much of what's happening that's actually a material turn to create investment capacity is actually in IT, it's in finance, because, you know, we all have computers. You can automate getting the ticket when your computer doesn't work, and then you can use artificial intelligence to do self-correcting.
Sure.
Right? So that obviously creates, you know, lowers costs.
Right.
The power of artificial intelligence, though, will ultimately be really in growth, right? And what you can do to change your business models. That's where it's much more about experimentation today. You're at the very beginning of that growth curve.
So a lot of folks talk about the implications, particularly as you say, for automation on the workforce, and I'm going to get to that, but I want to start with the implications of what you just said for leadership, which I know is something you've emphasized quite a bit. Who are the right leaders in that kind of environment?
Well, it's a great question, because it's interesting how most people go directly to workforce transformation when it's really about right leaders. And that's the second question we have CEOs ask. And there's really 3 characteristics. We say innovation mindset, inspiring leaders, and responsible leaders. And what we mean by that is the power of these technologies is in actually reimagining your business and doing something different. And so you have to have leaders who have an innovation mindset, who are willing to say, I know we've done it this way, but could we do it differently? The second thing is they have to be inspiring, and this is a piece that many companies don't get right. And why do I say inspiring? If you're going to reimagine how you do things, if we're living in a world where you've got to continuously change and you have to have your skills changing, you have to have leaders who can inspire people to follow them, who have empathy to understand what the workforce is going to go through, right? Because you'll have cultural change, you have to have a skills change, and all of that requires leaders who actually understand people and people want to follow. And the third piece, which we call responsible leaders, is about responsible artificial intelligence. And that is leaders who are going to think about the ethics, the governance of it, the implications on the workforce. And that requires a leader that's a much more holistic thinker than many of the leaders, frankly, that companies, have today, who've been using to operate, who are operators, or for whom that's somebody else's problem.
Right. And so for the workforce then, if you get the leader piece right, what are the big reskill, if that's even the term you prefer, what are the big reskill challenges, and how should we think about that even at a societal level?
Well, it's interesting. If you think about artificial intelligence, we think about it as augmenting humans. So there are certain things that technology is much better at. Speed, processing huge amounts of data that an individual that couldn't. But there are things that humans are much better at. Empathy, emotional intelligence, creativity, right? And then there are the things in the middle where you can put them together. So first of all, there's a whole set of jobs that are now being created, which are brand new. And those are jobs that are not necessarily even four-year degrees. They're jobs to train artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence are algorithms, and they have to be trained by data. And if you think about it, you know, calling Alexa and Siri, they have different personalities, right? So if you just think about the customer experience, as a company, you have to decide, what do you want your virtual agent to be like? Wait, well, those are people who have to be trained. And so there's a whole set of jobs that are being created now. We don't have enough people just to actually be able to have artificial intelligence, in fact, reimagine in business. On top of that, though, is because the AAA, so if you put it all together, is going to eliminate jobs, right? It is inevitable. It is going to create jobs as well, but they're different jobs. Right. And so one of the things that we really work with companies to address is, when there's going to be workforce disruption, do you have people who could be upskilled? In other words, can you reinvest some of your savings to retrain them? At Accenture, over a 2-year period, we automated 20,000 jobs. We reinvested 60% of the savings, and we reskilled those individuals to do higher level jobs like analytics. And so we in our case, we were a growing business. Those were hard skills to find. And we had a strategy up front. I think one of the most important things that companies and boards have to do is to say, it's not an option to not deploy these technologies, right? For many companies, you take insurance, many insurance companies have lots of employees in the community, but they're being disrupted by complete online, who don't have to deal with legacy workforces. So they're going to be deploying these technologies. Right. So you can't simply say, I'm not going to because it'll cut jobs. But what you do have to say is, what is our strategy, right? And how many people could be actually upskilled? What will that cost, putting it in the business case? And then some of them will not be able to, or you can't afford to. And then what's the strategy to partner? And this is where the public-private sector partnership is so important. And we can talk about, you know, apprenticeships, which is something that we're working on, exactly because we believe as a country, we have to have different levers to retrain people, particularly white collar.
Can you talk a little bit about an example of one of those apprenticeship programs that you think has succeeded or is helping?
So we actually today, this year, we will have 150 apprenticeships, mostly in IT. And we started this 3 years ago, and we said, you know, we have a program called Skills to Succeed, which is providing skills to get a job or to start a business. And we really wanted to switch to say, how can we be more inclusive in terms of bringing more people into the digital economy? And we said, let's try apprenticeships. And we started very small. And it's been very successful. And we take, in Chicago, we started there with 8 apprenticeships 3 years ago. We partnered with the community college, Wright Community College, helped their curriculum, and we brought them into our IT department. And every large company has an IT department, right? And they've been extremely successful, and we're now growing that, and we're now doing it at client sites. So last year, Greg Case is the CEO of Aon. They have a program with the community college around actuarial, they're in insurance. And we got together and we said, this is really exciting for the country. Apprenticeships for white-collar professional jobs. It's different, right? It's different than the traditional. And we created the Chicago Apprenticeship Network, which now has 14 companies. It's got 300 apprentices that were created in the last year. We're committing to 1,000 more by the end of 2020. We at Accenture will have 300 next year on top of what we have. And we believe that from a U.S. competitiveness perspective, as you look at disruption, if we can create a foundation for apprenticeships, it'll be a great way to help mid-career reskilling as technology continues to disrupt jobs.
And what's the public sector role in that? The support to the community college? How does it play?
It's a couple of places. So there's the academics, so there's the community college, and then many of the programs, like our program, does focus on underrepresented communities. Many of the students, for example, don't come from families and have never worked in professional environments. So we work with not-for-profits who provide support and help some, and some of our training that we provide is on soft skills as well, because what we're trying to do is to make sure that we have an inclusive innovation economy, and many of the companies who are creating apprenticeships have those same goals. And so, and then in addition to that, in some states, they also are providing, credits and tax credits, which particularly for medium and small-sized companies are really important. Yeah. And so there's a role for, providing incentives as well.
So the other thing you hear a lot about AI as a concern is around security and privacy. Those are slightly different things, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where your concern lies, and if there are ways that you think we're making headway in mitigating those concerns on both the security side of AI and the privacy concerns of those cruise ship, cruisers who are worried, if you will, about giving over their data.
Well, if you look globally, I mean, the U.S. is behind with respect to really addressing data privacy, right? We do not have a national law like the GDPR in Europe, like what Brazil has done. And we're really actually, not only do we not have it, but we're at risk of falling behind as a country from a competitiveness perspective, because we're at risk of further fragmenting. There are right now, in the US, there are more than 24 states that are looking at different types of data privacy legislation.
Right.
Now, just imagine if we have completely fragmented.
Right.
So as a country, from a competitiveness perspective, and also we need, if we're going to continue down, which we are, it's inevitable, we need to protect consumers. And so we really, at Accenture, believe that we need a national law, and we're doing some work at the Business Roundtable and other places with respect to that. With respect to security, it's interesting. Artificial intelligence, of course, is tailor-made to improve security, because it looks at large amounts of data, it does great pattern detection. And so, if you look at startups and you look at technology that is being deployed to make you more secure, it all involves artificial intelligence. The problem is, of course, that just as it is great to do protecting it, in the hands of the bad guys, it helps, identify the vulnerabilities, right? And so I think understanding the two-sided nature of artificial intelligence is really important. And that's, we spend a lot of time focusing on that. So we use it to help make us more secure, but we also recognize, putting ourselves into the sort of the opposite, into the bad guys, shoes, is how it can, it can also harm us.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about leadership. The theme is, I think, quite naturally for you woven through everything you've already said, because I think that's where your heart is in leadership. Can you talk a little bit about what has molded you think, most as a leader? You mentioned before empathy. You mentioned the idea of being agile and innovative as things that you prize. Do you think those are hallmarks that you strive for yourself, and how have you shaped sort of the leadership persona that you would like to emulate?
Well, I mean, look, I think as a leader that we need to serve, right? And that really comes from how I grew up. I mean, I am living the American dream, right? So my father painted cars for a living. My mom and dad worked hard and said my mom should go to college. My father, didn't graduate from high school. So she graduated as I was entering college. And I grew up with parents. I remember they would help they volunteer at the church, because my parents used to say, we may not have money, but we have time. And I still remember when they had $500 in the bank, and they were volunteering, and they met this young couple who he'd gotten in some legal trouble, and they were worried about him having a public defender, and they took literally their only $500, like that was their entire life savings, to help this young man. And so if I say there's a lot, I've been so blessed by great mentors in that, but I go back to, we live in a great country, right? The fact that I'm the CEO of a $17 billion business, and am able to do what I'm able to do in this country, starting from, our background and where we started is amazing. And my parents were just model, people who gave to others.
Yeah. And you also had a significant health crisis in your mid-40s, deep into your career. You were a partner already in your firm, and you were close to being CEO, as I recall, if I've got the timeline right. How did that affect everything in your life? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was general counsel of Accenture at the time. I joined Accenture 8 years ago.
Right.
And I'd just been to Davos, the World Economic Forum, for the second year in a row, and I was part of the, I'm the part of the elite. I'm the global elite. We're solving world problems. And I remember I came back, and that week I went to get my mammogram, and I found out I had breast cancer. So that will bring you down to, to real life pretty quickly. And I was 46 at the time with 2 small children. My daughters now are 10 and 12. And so this was in 2014. But, one of the things that was great for me is that, it's a time of contemplation. And so I really thought a lot about my life. And the good news was that I said I didn't have any regrets. I felt like I'd made the right choices. They weren't the choices for all people. Not everyone would choose how I choose to live my life. But for me, they were the right choices. And so I was out for several months, and when I came back, 6 months later, I became CEO. So I have an amazing company, and they did not let it cause me to miss a beat in terms of my career. But one of the things I do now is I use that test, right? So being CEO, I travel a lot. I'm very busy. I thought general counsel was, but this is a much bigger job. And I will ask myself, if tomorrow I had a health issue, would I still be able to say I have no regrets? And it's a great way of keeping yourself grounded and focused. And sometimes the answer is, no, I wouldn't be able to say that. And then I can calibrate and make sure that I'm focusing on the things that are both important to me and my family personally, but also the things at work that are important.
Right. And one of those things that you've made very important for you is diversity and inclusion. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that issue set, which can, particularly right now in America, can feel very ripe for conflict? How do you bring an issue like that to the forefront, a priority for you as the CEO, and bring people along in common cause toward it?
Well, first of all, we as a company, from our board down, really believe that inclusion and diversity is not only the right thing to do, but it's also critical. We want to be an innovation-led company, and so we believe it's also critical to our business. And we treat it like a business priority. So we set goals, we hold leadership accountable. We look at the data. In fact, we have set a global goal to have gender parity by 2025 globally. We've set a goal in the U.S. to be at 40% women by 2020, and we've been on this journey for a while. We're very proud that this year the Thomson Reuters Diversity Inclusion Index, which is a global index, we were #1 on inclusion and diversity. Now I say that we're very proud of that, but we have a long way to go. And one of the things we're very focused on is inclusion, and so the diversity piece of attracting the right people and retaining is very important. But how does it feel at work? And in the U.S., where we have the broadest range of diversity, we think this is particularly important. And just last week, we held we have a program called Building Bridges, and it's how do you have dialogues about important issues at work around diversity. And it started actually in 2016. You may remember that terrible week where 2 African Americans were killed by police officers, and then there was the ambush of the police officers in Dallas, where 9 were killed. And that was the first time as a company we decided that we could no longer not talk about race at work. And probably one of the most difficult moments of my career is I decided, I not only sent out a note, but I decided we were going to have a national webcast about race. Not diversity, but race. And the night before I was quite nervous. No one had ever done this, and not everybody was sure this was the right answer. And for us, it was a complete turning point because, first of all, we had our African American community. I remember one young man saying, coming to work, like the silence was deafening, right? And so we started that, and it's become something we call Building Bridges, which is talking about these issues at work so that people can feel inclusive. So last Friday we had one on anti-Semitism. And because of the
Following on
terrible
Pittsburgh,
tragedy in Pittsburgh. And when that tragedy happened, I sent a note out to the entire community, and I talked about not just about the synagogue, but also, we've had the mosque in Wisconsin that was bombed. We had the Charleston church. We had a Sikh Gurdwara. So really inclusive, right? But having that, and that has been very important to us. And then finally, it is about transparency. So we became the first professional services company 2 years ago to put all of our numbers out around race, gender, persons with disabilities, and veterans, and we update it annually. And the reason that's important is because, first of all, transparency creates trust.
Right.
Our numbers were not great, but people believe we're serious when you're willing to share it. But the second thing is, if you're asking people to change, to spend time to understand, to make them more inclusive, to take the time to not just hire from the people you know in your network, doing so without saying, here's where we are, right? And being transparent, right, didn't feel authentic. And it has, I believe, as we look back at it, our transparency has been critical in really changing how people are embracing and making this a part of their own accountability, not because I say it, but because they believe it.
Are there pitfalls that you hit along the way that are worth sharing in terms of as people think ahead to their own companies and how they do this the right way versus the wrong way?
So
what were some learning steps? And we'll take cards too. By the way,
you get
please.
what you ask for, and I will tell you, when I first became CEO, I was having a conversation with someone. It was about an African-American managing director who I felt this particular leader was not adequately supporting. And I remember the leader said, well, Julie, I'm really good on gender. That's what you asked. That's what I've been asked to do. I really wasn't focused on this. And it was such an important lesson, right?
Right.
And as a leader, like what you focus on, your people focus on. Right?
Yeah.
And believe me, every place I went that year, I was extraordinarily clear about what we were focused on and what diversity at Accenture means. And so yes, we had goals around gender, but diversity was not limited to gender. Right.
And how do you make the case, you mentioned it as a given, but can you talk a little bit about how you make the case for why diversity is so important to an innovative company and innovation economy?
Well, I will say there are good studies out there that show financial performance improves when you have a diverse, this is focused on gender in particular, and there's good studies that say you have a higher percentage of innovation revenue when you have a gender diverse leadership team. Frankly, that's not enough though, and I will tell you, we just put out, I chair the US-Canadian Council on the Advancement of Women, and we just put out a study that is not positive, about that basically says the highest external commitment to gender diversity, and yet we have companies who are not tracking basic data.
Right.
And so you say to yourself, well, how is it possible to have very clear data that says companies perform better, and yet lots of companies, big, small, and medium, not doing basic things like having data on whether they're paying people equal or whether there's attrition differences. And I think that goes to making the case. At Accenture, we see it every day because we're an innovation-led company, and you do not get the best ideas when the team looks the same, whichever the team is. You have to have diversity. We hear it from our clients who will say to us, I remember one CIO said, she was kind of laughing. She goes, I'm the only woman on the leadership team, and it's all white males. But when your competitor came in with an all-white male team, they said, oh, we can't hire them. This is really innovative work. And she said they didn't quite get the irony of that. She goes, but they understood that when they're doing groundbreaking work, they need diversity, and you came in with a diverse team, right? Yeah. So we hear it from our clients, and we see it in the work that we're doing. 60% of our work last year was digital cloud and security. And our commitment and doubling down on diversity came at the same time as our strategy around being an innovation-led company.
So through your significant role on this issue set, you had opportunity to sit down with President Trump, Prime Minister Trudeau, and talk a little bit about women's empowerment and innovation. Can you tell us maybe a little backstory about how that all developed? And then what you took from that conversation in terms of where we could be headed in North America on these issues?
Sure. In fact, I was just with Prime Minister Trudeau at the Fortune Global Forum and had dinner at his house, and he was impressed at how much he'd actually followed the council's work, the council is independent of the two governments, but we were asked to be formed by them. And it was really formed at the time President Trump had just been in office, and Prime Minister Trudeau had come, and he was, of course, famous for his commitment to diversity and his leadership team being 50-50. And both leaders really felt that there's a competitive advantage to our economies to making sure that more women are participating. And so our council focused both on entrepreneurs as well as advancing women leaders. And the idea was to learn from each other. And it was fascinating because we really did. I mean, for example, one of the things my Canadian counterparts would say that they didn't realize was how effective and ubiquitous in large companies in the US are supplier diversity programs. And so in the US, we have, if you look at Accenture, $2 billion in spend, and 30% of it goes to women, minority, and veteran-owned companies. This is standard for most, certainly Fortune 100 and probably most Fortune 500 companies as well. Right. And in Canada, it is barely exists other than companies like Accenture, which we do it globally. Mm-hmm. And it was a great example of how do you bring women from different sectors together and learning from each other, and that was in one of our reports.
Yeah, that's amazing. We'll take the cards, Bev, when you're ready here. I know we have some questions from our audience, which will, I'm sure, necessitate these reading glasses. Okay, let's start here. And whoever used cursive, boy oh boy. AI is arguably being used to damage democracy. For instance, the Big Brother system being deployed in China, the social rating system, et cetera. How can Accenture or companies like it fight that use of AI and be a force for good in those kinds of challenges?
I think it's a great question. I mean, first of all, we have to have responsible AI, and that starts with companies and how they approach it, but also governments, right? And so the discussion around AI has to include what is responsible AI. How do you make sure bias isn't in there? How do you make sure that the use of it is good? So, it really goes to, in my mind, both companies starting there, but also governments talking about it.
Yeah. Okay, we had a couple along those lines, but let's talk a little bit about the skills side that AI won't replace: empathy, communication, et cetera. Someone in the audience notes these are things that women are actually considered to be particularly good at. Will women have an advantage in the AI revolution? That's an interesting tying together of some themes.
It's interesting. I actually get asked this a lot, and I do think women have an advantage to the extent that women often are seen and in fact are more collaborative. And I will tell you that the thing we see at Accenture all the time is, if you take artificial intelligence, most of it is not something today that's a solution, right? It's being, we call co-innovated with our clients, which means you're taking lots of different people together. And so people who work, men or women, collaboratively, and teams, which requires, by the way, better social skills and empathy and how to do it, are going to be much more successful going forward.
We also had a question on how much cooperation is really happening among Fortune 500 companies, or however you want to define it, about how to incorporate AI. How much sharing of information and common practices there in business strategy and operations?
I would say not a lot. Mm-hmm. It's competitive, frankly. There's some places where companies are coming together to say, where they don't want to invest necessarily independently, but I'd say that's not the norm.
Interesting. Why? And because it's competitive.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anything on the public policy side that would shift that?
Well, I think, so one big area that I think we have to think about, so the flip side to having a national, law is you need a national data privacy law. But if you think of the issue, particularly around China, with data and lack of less regulation there, to compete both by just the sheer size of the population, right, there needs to be more sharing of data. Because at the end of the day, artificial intelligence, is successful by the more data that you have. And so I do believe that there is a opportunity for the public-private sector to cooperate on how do we find a...
And it fits with what you've described, if you will, as a very practical, concrete ways in which we're having change through AI. Can you foresee major strategic approaches, whether it's companies or governments, where AI, isn't just a pipe dream of how it might change things, but where we're actually going in potential?
I mean, look, today, right, so there's an estimate that 759 million people go hungry today. In the next 50 years, there's going to be more food that was needed in the last 10,000 years, right? Literally today, there are solutions using artificial intelligence, which are taking data, external data, weather data, usually using drones, looking at that to make recommendations on how to, to change, things to either farmers or for larger, their managers that are increasing the yield and decreasing waste and pesticides, right? So that is a very clear societal problem. Anti-money laundering, there's $3 trillion of illicit funds today. Less than 1% are frozen and found through fraud and compliance today, despite the fact that almost $300 billion is spent a year.
Amazing.
We are working right now with banks, also with regulators who have to approve it, to use artificial intelligence to decrease what are false positives. So you have tons of people spending all this time following false positives and not spending enough time on the real stuff. That is real today, and we'll go after it.
Yeah,
right?
those are great examples. One person asking about whether it's problematic to think about responsible AI being primarily or starting with companies and then extending to government. Shouldn't the question being, shouldn't the government be leading on AI innovation and policy? And if it's not, then how does it catch up? What are the key factors for how it can catch up?
I think there's been a paradigm shift. I mean, you saw it in cyber first, right? In cyber, who's the front line of defense? It is the private sector,
Right.
Right. Here, I think what I would call is the same way. I would call it co-innovation, right? Because first of all, there's a lot of unknowns, right? And it's hard enough in the private sector to get the talent. It's really difficult in the government sector, right? And so I really think it has to be done together. And you take facial recognition, for example. Like, there aren't laws today that really work for facial recognition. There is going to have to be some kind of regulation around that appropriately, right? Mm-hmm. But how to do that is really something to do together with the private sector. And so I don't think it's a question of who should lead. I think it's a question of determining where you should regulate, what's the appropriate role for government, and then how do we help each other? How does the private sector and the government work together to get it right? Are
you finding a much reaching out from the public sector to companies like you CEOs like yourself, to try to understand and manage through this period, or is it too diffuse for that right now? Where are we on that?
No, it's happening around the world. I would say that I think, despite lots of dialogue in the U.S., the U.S. is behind other countries, and I'm not just talking about China,
right.
In Europe, for example, where there's a much clearer innovation agenda,
right.
They're picking priorities. I mean, today, from a U.S. perspective, if we would say there's 5 areas that we want to really win, we want to be the collaborative robotics for manufacturing because we want to own manufacturing. We want to bring it back to the U.S., right? And we're going to win there. We're going to, you pick the 5 areas, and then you say, the government's got a role in funding some of it, the private sector does, academia, and you line it up, we would be so much more effective. And that is what other countries are doing.
And do you think the private sector, to turn that around, is what you've just expressed is a shared perspective, if you will, that will create momentum to get the government sector awakened and maybe the electorate or public awakened to that point? Or are we going to hit, frankly, a crisis because there isn't that sense of urgency around these issues?
I think there's a growing sense of urgency, and I do believe that companies, and I know the work at the Business Roundtable that we're doing, I chair the technology committee there, is very focused on exactly these topics. I do think we need, all of us, more of a sense of urgency. It is very countercultural, right? And so, at the same time, I think there's a widespread recognition of the need.
So we talked a lot about AI tonight. As you said yourself, it has many manifestations. People often think of the alligator closest to the boat being the automation piece in manufacturing. Can you jump ahead for us as CEO? Obviously, you're thinking out over the long term. Where do you think you are going on technology and integrating new approaches into Accenture and your offerings? How are you thinking about that?
So one of the ways that we really think about it is we've become an innovation-led company with an innovation strategy. So really 5 years ago we said, our core business is declining, and so we're going to invest there to grow it while we scale the new. And they said, so what's the new? And we defined it as digital, cloud, and security, and that was less than 20% of our business at the time. But we said at all times, we're going to scale the new, we need to be looking to the future. So we said, this is going to be the new. We're going to have the new, so what will come next, and then the next new. So at the time, the new was artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things, and the next new was blockchain and augmented reality. So fast forward 5 years, we're now 60% digital, cloud, and security. So that's become the core. We last year then took what was the new artificial intelligence. That had come, we'd incubated, it's now big. It's now the new that we're scaling.
Right.
And blockchain and augmented reality have been moved forward in terms of investment, and now quantum computing is the next future. So we have a very disciplined way of looking at our business. And this is what many companies are now striving for. And this is this idea of continuous innovation, right? And it takes a disciplined capital allocation, but also the willingness to say, what is really happening with our core business? What do we have to do while we scale the new? And then being really relentlessly focused on it.
Right. And all the while, you had mentioned to me when we had talked before coming out here, that you all have what I assume is an industry approach. You have a lot of turnover. You're turning over senior people throughout that as you change. So what's the strategy for in a change economy where you're trying to innovate and have tech? How do you think about the human capital piece of it and growing and retaining the kind of talent that you want that's appropriate to that?
Well, I think there's two pieces. You have to have the right leaders,
Yep.
right? And so we were a company that when I joined 8 years ago used to say very proudly, we are fast followers. That is a certain kind of leader,
Yes.
right? So when we switched and said we're going to rotate to the new, we're going to become an innovation-led company, we had to redefine what leadership is. And so we needed leaders who were not operators, that the metric wasn't how many people and how big your P&L was, but what were the growth opportunities?
Yep.
Are you comfortable with ambiguity? Are you a smart risk taker? So if you don't have the right leaders, the rest is not going to come. You're not going to innovate unless you have leaders with an innovation mindset. So we started very much, and we had a major rotation of our leaders. Some retired and some into new roles, and that was important. Then you have to look at the workforce. We had to make a pivot to say we are really going to be a company with continuous learning. We're rotating to these new areas where we can't go hire everyone. We have to reskill. But we used to do either fly everybody someplace, and that was really expensive, and that was sort of a one and done. You're going to go to training once every 3 years.
That's right, yeah.
Not viable in today's world. or really bad computer-based training, right? So we had to create,
I think we've all had some of that in our lives.
Right, so we had to create a totally different kind of training. So we created something called digital learning boards that is curated content. They're everything from 7 minutes to an hour. They're external and internal. In the last 2 years, we have now 460,000 people, but in the last 2 years, 22 million discrete learning activities have occurred on these learning boards, right? So we have changed our culture. They're not mandated, right? But we've changed the culture with the leaders because they model it. I have a quarterly learning program, and I talk about it wherever I go. I said every quarter I set my objectives. What am I going to learn this quarter? I am the CEO and I have to do that. And then I ask everyone, I said, if you have anybody working for you, then every quarter you need to have set up some kind of a training. We have lots of available. If not, you are not fulfilling your obligations as a leader to your people.
Yeah,
right?
that's fantastic.
So that cultural change, so change your leaders, focus on your workforce. But if you just say go learn and you don't provide the tools, that's not going to help either.
Yeah. Julie Sweet, an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time today and for the leadership that you're giving in innovation and to women. So please join me in a round of applause.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You can take your bite out.